Thank you for watching this video from the Center for European Studies at Carleton University. This event was organized by the Center for European Studies and Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue, and supported by Carleton University and by grants from the European Union and Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The views expressed in this video are solely those of the presenter and do not reflect the views of the European Union, Center for European Studies, and Carleton University.
Thanks very much for the invitation today, and delighted to spend a bit of time with you to speak about these issues. And I'm hoping it complements nicely a couple of presentations we've seen so far. As Alex suggests, I'm looking at a different part of the electricity system in Ontario. And in particular, I'm interested in starting or continuing a conversation about the linkages or connections between two different areas, or at least two areas that I'm thinking in this province have largely been separate. And that first area is with regard to the advocacy and analysis on the part of vulnerable, largely low-income households in Ontario. And the second one, a focus of our deliberations for the past day and a half, is the increased deployment of distributed renewable electricity. So basically what I'm here to do is to identify each of these two areas, and I'll provide a bit of a context by saying a few words about each of these in the Ontario context. And then I'll present a few ideas about connections between the two. And these connections that I'd like to suggest might be useful as early warning signs and or early signs of opportunity for the kinds of future that Danny laid out, to make those as positive on whatever criteria we want to lay out. So after I'll look into those four connections, I'll throw out a few recommendations at the end, and then, like my other speakers, I'll look forward to what you're interested in coming back on in the discussion at the end as well. So let me start with just a couple of slides about vulnerable households. And in the investigation of the ways in which some households have had a challenge to, either as a saying often goes, to heat or eat, there are many phrases that are used to describe them. So we've come across phrases like fuel poverty or energy precariousness. And I've just pulled out a quote here from the Low Income Energy Network, a coalition that's active in this province, and they use the term vulnerable consumer, noting that there's no explicit definition. And I'll use it as a catch-all phrase to look at those kinds of people that I'm interested in, and the last three households I'm interested in. The last two or three lines of this definition give you an idea. Low-income households, including single-parent-led families, the disabled, seniors, and those in receipt of social assistance. So those who may not have the resilience in the face of energy system transformations, and trying to think about how we can ensure public policy or other procedures are there to ensure that they prosper and thrive as well. A couple of statistics in the Ontario case here about the number of, and here I've just got some things about low-income households in particular. About 1 in 9 households in Ontario are categorized as low income, and relatively more are led by single parents or are doing renting instead of owning their dwelling. So this is the kind of characteristics, the kinds of households I'm talking about on that one side of these two areas I've identified. With regard to the second area, distributed renewable electricity, a couple of relevant definitions, and I don't think I need to spend much time with this crowd about it. I guess I just flagged that it can be a contested term as well. I've got an NRCan definition up there, which talks in sort of 10,000 foot level. In the Ontario context, one way of thinking about it is seeing what's being supported in the FIT program and the microfit program. And my comments will be very much in the spirit of, I think, the other speakers up here, often talking about the new renewables that are investigating. They're distributed, they're often local, and a lot of them will be solar, PV, and wind as well. Similarly, some statistics in the Ontario situation. I'm just smiling here because I think both Nick and Danny put up forms of this, and I'll just, damn lies and statistics. You can slice and dice in many different ways. I'm focusing on energy generation here. Nick had some numbers about capacity, which were a bit larger because of, as he said, the capacity factors of renewables. Renewables account for, in 2014, wind about 4% of our overall energy portfolio, solar a figure less than 1%. That's in the grid-connected situation. There's so-called embedded generation in this province, which I'm just seeing from the ISO now. Data are starting to emerge. So when you add the embedded generation that's closer to the loads and so on the other side of particular meters, solar goes up a bit, wind goes up a bit, but they're still certainly in single digit as overall contributions. What will the future hold? Danny knows. What will the future hold? The long-term energy plan may know as well, which has been cited by my colleagues already. They suggest 10 years from now, solar and wind will have ramped up a little bit, but we will not have those large-scale transformations that are possible in at least one of the scenarios we've seen so far. But if the conversations here about increasing contributions to transportation and perhaps various home energy services, those numbers could be higher and create increasing demand for renewables as well. So those are my two domains, and just as a reminder, trying to think about the connections or linkages between energy poverty, vulnerable households, represented on the left by a brochure from my home area about a group who help out those people who are finding it difficult to make ends meet at the end of every week and are having to make some very difficult choices that their financial assistance is available. They've got their eye on the short term, very understandably so. Whereas on the right-hand side, I've just pulled out something from the IESO's Smart Home Roadmap, which has its eye on the long term. Again, understandably so, thinking about how to spark innovation in the connected home, in distributed electricity systems and so on, and put out ideas where distributed renewable electricity generation is an important part of it. Before I get to my four brief examples, I guess I'll just flag a bit of an apology here that when I think about distributed renewable electricity, I immediately think about it within a system, a modernized electricity system that will have not only these supply elements we're talking about, but will also have advanced demand management elements as well. So where I often think of it being part and parcel of a new system that will be integrated, intercommunicating, it will be nimble, adaptive, and reactive, and lots of flows of information and potentially, as I'll flag in a minute, flows of energy as well. But let me go on to my four connections. And first one I have is that an interconnected energy system with more distributed renewable electricity will mean that more data are generated and are available for us. David this morning was saying he could look on his smart app to see how his house was performing. Maybe he's getting his solar panels to tweet at him. I know that is happening as well in some ways. So I've just got an example there on the left where on the supply side, you've got, this is from SunPower, looking at the ways in which a lot of data are provided. On the right is on the demand side from a project we've been involved in where you've got the consumption going on. Lots of information about what your house is doing, not only at an aggregate whole energy level, but at a sub-meter level as well. What does this mean for, in particular, vulnerable households? Well, it can mean some good things for sure, in the sense of it can lead to better energy management. Knowledge and information can be power. It can identify opportunities. Perhaps poorly functioning devices can be identified, isolated, and remedies that are very cost-effective and comfort-enhancing can be employed. It can also be positive because a lot of vulnerable households want a budgeting and feedback mechanisms with regard to how they're managing their energy portfolio, their energy money envelope. So these data can be harnessed in order to give that real-time information for better household management as well. A con could well be that this has come up so far, this notion of more information is more privacy and security. When David was logging into his solar household, I was doing the same on his household sitting over there. No, I wasn't, but the argument is that conceivably that could be done. At other conferences, I've put up a chart of the electricity I've downloaded from my home through my local distribution company, and it's very clear when we were away on holiday. Others suggest that this can reveal patterns as to what's going on in the household. What does this mean in particular for vulnerable households? Well, through the work we've done, we often find that there's a desire for some of them to stay under the radar. That is a desire for them to not necessarily be fully engage with all these information flows, and if more data is seen to be more big brother in some ways, that can be a challenge for engagement potentially. A second area I'll flag is with regard to electricity partnerships. So the days of the monolithic, faceless, nameless, I guess it's not nameless, and electricity utility getting in touch with you once every 2 months and sending you a bill, and that's the only interaction that you have with your energy system, electricity provider, that's probably long gone, and many think that in the future electricity world, there will be multiple partnerships involving lots of different players. So Accenture, a global consultancy firm, released an interesting report this year, The New Energy Consumer, Understanding Business Value in a Digital World. And they said the power of collaboration continues to be a fundamental current of change in the energy system. Those of you sitting in Ontario may well have seen commercials from Rogers, for example, talking about energy services they provide. That may be keeping you up at night in a nightmare scenario, but we won't get into that. There's lots of others. You go to Canadian Tire or Home Depot, there's all of a sudden devices that you can buy for home energy management as well, where 20, 30 years ago it may not have been as prevalent. A concern or a wonder about the impact upon vulnerable households is how attractive will vulnerable households' electricity accounts be? So the notion that there will be lots of partners engaged in trying to make connections and arguably profitable connections in the new energy world. They'll be looking for households that have higher energy consumption, a lot of discretionary loads, lots of space for siting renewable energy or storage technologies, very good credit ratings, and so on and so forth. Not moving frequently. Those are characteristics that do not identify with vulnerable households to a great extent. So there's a concern that they could well be left behind, and that could have implications for fairness. It could have implications for the well-being of our community more broadly. A third area I'll identify is with regard to the emergence of the prosumer. So prosumer is a term that's been used in a lot of different domains. In the electricity domain, it's referred to those households that not only consume electricity, as perhaps many of our households do already, but also produce and store electricity as well. And a question that, and this is by means of PV panels on the roof, for instance, or some sort of batteries or a Tesla Powerwall in the basement or something like that. A question that arises is, what's the impact upon vulnerable households of this? Well, again, it may be an attractive play to be a prosumer, but there may be barriers to entry for vulnerable households to engage in being a prosumer. Notwithstanding new innovative approaches to accessing finance and so on, the inability to access inexpensive capital may be a barrier to entry. The fact that vulnerable households may not have resilience in the face of uncertainty may be a barrier to entry as well. And it raises the split incentive problem of the landlord-tenant relationship. That is, that households may want to engage in this prosumer issue, vulnerable households may want to, but in addition to not having the capital to do so, they may not have the agency to do so. They may be in rented accommodation and therefore may not have the authority to access the building envelope in some way, or may not have the insurance that they're staying there long enough to reap the benefits of playing this new kind of game. And a fourth area I'll flag is with regard to the sharing economy, or as I'm not sure if I should say Uber in this city, given my drive from the airport. But the Uberization or the Airbnbization of the electricity industry, what could that have as potential impacts? And to give this a little bit of a tangible feel to it, some envision a situation in which myself here in Ontario, or you as well in this province, someday might be able to, when they're wandering down their main street, looking to get a boost for their mobile device on a community wireless charger, they could log on to an electricity sharing site. They could then submit their needs in terms of kilowatt hours, charge time, electron source, for example, wind, solar, or gas, and business standing of the generator. What was their rating in corporate social responsibility last year, for instance? And then they wait for the supplier's various offers to come in, and when something matches their offer, a bid that they like, they accept it, and they can go on their own. We in Ontario only dream, but our European friends in the Netherlands can live this reality today. So there's a small startup company that I read about, Vandebrong, who is doing this, trying to look at the ways in which there are linkages between those demanding particular characteristics of electricity services and those offering it as well. Again, the Airbnb or Uberization of the electricity system. What would this mean for vulnerable households? It would reiterate, I think, the importance of energy literacy, which I haven't talked about a lot, we can dig into if you want, and the importance of energy partnerships as well. It could be that all of a sudden you've got a very distributed system and there are decisions being made about, I think I heard in Danny's comments, the natural gas backing up the renewables. Where is that plant sited? And then it might be a function of communities' powers as to the influence they have about siting facilities. And then what happens if all this sharing of the electricity, direct interchanges over the local wires, means that grid defections increase? And James yesterday mentioned the so-called utility death spiral. If it becomes a reality and you've got communities simply saying, I don't need the grid anymore, I simply need it as an insurance policy, all of a sudden the costs of managing the grid are borne upon a smaller number of shoulders, if I can say, and it's suggested that maybe the lower income households, the vulnerable households, are those who don't have the choice, the option to defect. Well, utilities, they then step back and say, well, what do we do? What's our business model? And what would happen to those who continue to rely upon utilities in that world? So in summary, I'll just say that there's lots of good things that can come out of renewable electricity, and we've talked about this over the last day and a half very nicely. And a lot of them are benefits that diffuse across society more broadly. And this are things like clean air, less congestion, more sustainable and livable communities, and so on. What I've just tried to do is bring out and try to stimulate some discussion about when we zero in on connections between a particular subsection of our society and renewable electricity, are different kinds of issues raised. And I'll offer 3 recommendations before a final quick slide or 2. First is to keep the value proposition for vulnerable households clearly in sight. That will ensure that renewable electricity strategies serve to achieve benefits for all in our society. A second one is engage vulnerable households in renewable electricity development. I think we've seen that a sustainable energy system is one in which all citizens are engaged, and as some aren't engaged, they can feel disenfranchised, they can feel bitter, they can misinformation, miscommunication can rise. It may not have been in this context, but Nick, I think, mentioned there is a little bit of backlash, so we can talk more generally about ways in which the warm, fuzzy feeling about renewable electricity can fade. Take a holistic approach in energy poverty, sustainable energy policy making. Think about the ways in which there can be synergies between the 2 sets of policies. This is work that's from a larger project that Gord Stephen and I have done, and it's work that was supported by the Metcalfe Foundation, so I'd like to acknowledge the support that they've given us. It's been much appreciated, and also the acknowledgement of the 15 interviewees and the 7 other individuals who assisted with that. If anyone, we hope the report will come out within a matter of months. If anyone is interested in a copy, I'd be delighted to pass it on. And if anyone's interested in, I'm hearing bells, if anyone's interested in continuing the conversation beyond today, always happy to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you.